Hello and welcome to Main Street Books virtual gathering space. I am Beth Helfrich, events manager, and on behalf of our staff and the Charlotte Writers Club North, I am thrilled to welcome you tonight to hear from one of North Carolina's most important writers, one who, with her debut novel, Even As We Breathe, illuminates a story, or stories really, about a place and people for whom stories are vital but rarely captured and heard to audiences beyond. We're so grateful for this work and for this book. Annette Saunooke Clapsaddle is an enrolled member of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians and resides in Qualla, North Carolina with her family, her husband, Evan, and her sons, Ross and Charlie. She holds degrees from Yale University and the College of William and Mary. This, her debut novel, was released by the University Press of Kentucky just over a year ago, and it's been named a finalist for the Weatherford Award and one of NPR's best books of 2020. Her first novel manuscript, Going to Water, is winner of the Morning Star Award for Creative Writing from the Native American Literature Symposium in 2012, and is also a finalist for the Penn Bellwether Prize for Socially Engaged Fiction in 2014. Clapsaddle's work has appeared in Yes Magazine, Lit Hub, Smoky Mountain Living Magazine, South Writ Large, and The Atlantic. After serving as executive director of the Cherokee Preservation Foundation, Annette returned to teaching at Swain County High School. She's the former co-editor of the Journal of Cherokee Studies and serves on the board of trustees for the North Carolina Writers Network. And without further ado, I'm just going to start jumping into a good conversation with Annette Saunooke Clapsaddle. Annette, welcome so much.
Thank you, Beth. I'm happy to be here. Happy to see everybody online this evening.
And I was already saying to her in the green room before we started, which is fitting because she's actually in a green room, that the fact that she is doing an event like this after a day of teaching is mind-boggling to me. And I just want to give her the shout out she more than deserves for her work in the classroom as well. So we salute you for your teaching efforts.
Thank you.
I have so many questions, and I really I'm really looking forward to talking about this novel, which I loved. Before we jump in, I'm wondering if you could read for us, just so we can get a sense of your voice and the voice of the novel. And I think you had selected the prologue as a piece that you'd be willing to read. So if you can do us the honor.
Yeah, absolutely. I like to read the prologue, one, because there are no spoilers in the prologues there. And then also, I think it introduces us to place and voice. And even if you've read the novel, it's kind of fun to go back and reread the prologue after reading it. About the place. When I take you there or when you find it on your own, just know that what the old folks say is true. This land is ours because of what is buried in the ground, not what words appear on paper. But also know this, what is buried in the ground isn't always what you think. It's just the beginning. It's the beginning of, it's the beginning of the story, the beginning of all of us who call ourselves Homo sapiens. Fitting, I guess, that what I found buried, just as I was trying to figure out how to become a man and still be human, was the very thing that threatened to take it all away. Just when I began to see what taking control of my own life might look like, I realized I was not who I thought, and neither was this place. That summer in 1942, when I met her, when I really met her, before I found myself in a white man's cage and entangled in the barbed wire that destroyed my father, I left the cage of my home in Cherokee, North Carolina. I left these mountains that both hold and suffocate, and went to work at the pinnacle of luxury and privilege, Asheville's Grove Park Inn and Resort. I guess I convinced myself that I could become fortunate by proximity, escape Uncle Bud's tirades and my grandmother Leishy's empty kitchen cabinets just by driving a couple of hours up the road. It sounded good to tell folks I was raising money for college, but the truth was I didn't know what I was doing. I just didn't want to do it there anymore. And if I stayed any longer, I would become rooted so deeply, I might as well have been buried. My plan didn't quite work the way I thought it would. When I got to the resort, I mostly stayed outside, cut the trees, mowed the grass, and helped to dig the holes that would sink signs and posts for barbed wire fences. Music occasionally seeped from the ballroom, but was muted by thick lead-paned windows before one note ever reached the perimeter of the property. That's where I first found the bone. I was on my hands and knees pitching rocks and digging holes. It was just as the end, like its music, was becoming dulled by wartime restrictions and hushed by lead bullets. The prisoners, who were actually diplomats and foreign nationals treated more like guests, weren't really known to me yet. That little girl, God bless her soul, had barely even stepped foot on the property, and I was still as free as I would ever be. I squatted there by the fence along the boundary of the Grove Park property and grasped the bone by its middle, pointing both ends upward, studying its curvature, a bent bauble for my idle adolescent hands to fidget with in the absence of a ball stick or a soldier's rifle. I can't recall playing with many toys as a child. That's probably why the bone spoke poetry to me as a young man. It was smooth and porous, its slight C-curve angled in motion, calling to be grasped, used, a weapon, at least in some primitive function of strength, like a subhuman scythe, though innately human, maybe even the very core of humanity. And now, as I recall the moment out loud, it was an embarrassing indulgence of make-believe for a 19-year-old. It's all right to laugh, I don't blame you. Such an extraordinary object to be inside flesh. It was wholly earthen, not sterile or cellular. It was natural in a way we pray our body is not, momentary, seasonal, destined for expiration. The bone had lost its story, petrified into a mere alkaline deposit, transient and nameless. I was immediately spellbound by this calcified opportunity to embrace a remnant of life's existence in one hand, dry it, dust it, preserve it, and listen. Buried by a story, and I was the only one on this earth privileged to hear it. Cowney, it seemed to coo my name like the beautiful girls of my daydreams, the ones who never took interest in boys like me. Just as I was yet to know of a certain beautiful girl's power, I was yet to understand the power that bone would wield over my life. I was yet to know how much more I would risk for her, for it. I am bits and pieces of people I meet, my teacher once told me, though more accurately, I am of people and places and creatures. And so because of that summer and that war and that small hollow relic, I am bits and pieces of a grand estate and a half-tame primate and a dozen accents and a missing girl and a fearful girl and all the trees and mountains and asphalt in between. And you, well, I reckon you will be too soon enough. Knowing that she is now gone from this earth, all I'm left to do is wonder what remains of her here. For me, for anyone who knew or didn't know her, what happens to the memories? How long do they survive? I can still see her dancing, head thrown back laughing. If there's one thing old age has taught me, it's that there are many kinds of love. She taught me that sometimes we feel many different kinds with one person. And now it seems possible that love is the only thing that will outlive us all, but only if we continue to tell its story.
This is where we're all clapping. Thank you for sharing that in your voice. The first question I do have for you has to do with this voice itself. So Cowney Sequoyah is your narrator and the protagonist of this story. Where did he come from?
Well, I didn't make a conscious decision necessarily whether I was going to choose a male or female protagonist. But what I was looking for was a protagonist that was at a place in their life where they were curious and wanted to explore a different setting, but also, unsure of themselves. And so, as you mentioned, I teach high school, and Cowney is like so many of the young men that I have taught over the years, intelligent and has a bright future ahead of him, but not necessarily, fitting into the context of traditional school, right? Not necessarily the best student, but still really curious about life and willing to take some risk, but unsure as well. So, I think Cowney comes from my students. Cowney comes from the fact I have an older brother, I have a lot of guy friends who have watched, especially, my guy friends from Cherokee who are just trying to kind of find their way at that point in their life. So, and he just made a lot of sense to me, to be a young man, right on the pinnacle of his future.
It's such a timeless story. It's so clearly rooted in a very specific moment in history. So for some context, for those of you who've not read the book, it is a World War II historical fiction piece. It's got elements of, kind of mystery, a little bit of some twists and turns for sure, and takes place in a real place, a place that you know very well. But his voice to me felt so authentically coming of age, and he wrestles with big questions for sure, but also the embarrassment of having said the wrong thing or revealed too much of himself or being too vulnerable. And so I appreciated that. In terms of this place, so this place so well. You did go away and ultimately chose to come back. What can you tell us about the history of this place in terms of how it was told to you, the history of your people? You are a member of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. What are the stories that kind of characterize or help you understand this place?
Yeah, I was right before we got on this call, I was just thinking about this. I've had several events lately, and I was doing prep for another event that's coming up, and the lady I was talking to said that they typically do a land acknowledgement statement before their events, and she asked me the question, and I've had this happen before, but she asked me the question last night, I think it was, if I had a land acknowledgement that I wanted to make as well. And I kind of laughed to myself because I wanted to say, what do I say? That this is the historical land of the Cherokee and it's still our land. It's like it usually doesn't go that way with land acknowledgements. But it reminded me that I feel very lucky that I am able to still live on our ancestral land. So the Eastern Band of Cherokee is of course part of Cherokee Nation in general, and then it was the removals of the 1930s. The Indian Removal Act, not 1930s, but a little bit earlier, that pushed the part of the Cherokee to Oklahoma and split up our tribes. So now there's 3 fairly recognized tribes since the Indian removal, and 2 are in Oklahoma, and the Eastern Band, the tribe that I am a citizen of, is the only one still on our ancestral land. And so growing up, it was always that story of resistance, of being stewards of this environment, and fighting for it. And it's not uncommon, it's not unlike people of Appalachia in general. We have a lot of similarities in that way, in being fierce protectors of our land. and stewards of this land that we've been on for generations. So I think the stories that I hear the most growing up all really connect back to being rooted and being a defender of the integrity of this land.
It's interesting because one of the sort of side plots that's happening is a forest fire or a series of fires. And so you play with this notion of suffocation by the smoke that's coming from these fires and threatening the land. And it's unclear, who's starting it or why it's so dry, whereas it's not down in Asheville. Can you talk a little bit about that choice to add that piece and weave it in as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So a little bit of a, I won't say backstory, it's actually a future story, but my book came out the same summer that David Joy's latest book came out and Leah Hampton's book came out. And coincidentally, all three of us have references to fires in our book. And I don't know if this is necessarily true, but it made me think that we were all writing at the same time, because I know for me, I was writing when we had these terrible fires in Western North Carolina, but also like Eastern Tennessee. So like Pigeon Forge, Gatlinburg area just was devastated. But I remember here the heaviness of the air. I remember just that smell constantly, just walking into school every day, and it's just this heaviness. And so that physically affected me as I was reading, and I thought about the weight that puts on us from day to day, and how that can translate, of course, to setting a tone in a book. And so I like to think about, the advice, or just kind of the recognition that good literature is felt in the body. And so when I talk to my students about literary devices and using sensory detail, I think they automatically think five senses. Oh, what do you see, what do you smell, what do you taste, those kind of things. But it's also the pressure around us. Like, what does the air feel like? What is the temperature? And so that fire experience, just writing during it, really helped me to think about it, almost symbolically in the book. This potential destruction of land, and then to know that it's probably purposeful as well for economic reasons. I mean, all of these kind of motifs are front and center for Western North Carolina, actually a lot of places, but I can only speak to Western North Carolina. And they're contemporary. Most of this book, I don't think it is technically historical fiction, but I don't think of it in that way when it comes to a lot of the themes.
Mm-hmm. Well, I agree. And so that's another of my questions, which is why did you choose to set it in 1942? And between these two worlds, his home in Cherokee, and then he has a job at the Grove Park Inn, which is a place that many of us probably do have a point of reference for. We've either seen it or seen pictures of it or have a sense of that part of Asheville. Why these two places and why that point in time?
Sure. So this is I think this is a setting-driven novel, something I never thought that I would write, because it really started, well, a couple of things were going on at the same time, but in terms of the plot in general, I had read an article in the Asheville Citizen-Times that had talked about the Grove Park's role during World War II. That they had held Axis diplomats and foreign nationals as prisoners of war for one summer. And I'd never heard that history before. I had talked to some folks after I read the article who are local historians, and they weren't familiar with that history as well. So I was fascinated with that. I was fascinated that this place of this high class resort, it's very opulent. I can't afford to stay there, that it was converted to a prison, essentially. Really, I found that really intriguing. But it also triggered a memory for me that um, that during World War II, some Japanese internment camps were set up on Indian reservations out west and near Indian reservations out west. And I remember when I learned about that, how interesting that is to think about um, land being converted to prison and how easy it was to do on some of those reservations, how similar those reservations were to prisons, to juxtapose that with the Grove Park and how those prisoners were treated and their environment. And so it really lent itself for me to dig into these questions about identity and citizenship and belonging, because there's a war going on. You have, um, people from citizens of the world, right, on American soil, and so it was a great opportunity to talk about sovereignty from a Native American perspective, and bring Cowney and Essie, members of another sovereign nation, just not that far down the road, and place it all on one property. And I was really interested in what that would do, what conversations would happen when you do something like that. And it was important to me that it didn't stay at the Grove Park, that we saw Cherokee as it really is, because well, we don't see it in literature. I mean, it's the first novel from the Eastern Band, so I definitely want to take the opportunity to show what it's like to live here, and the best I could in 1942, but a lot of it is still like it is in 2021.
Mm-hmm. One of the realizations, or I think something that Cowney comes to realize that's really tragic, is how easily Black and brown people might be erased. So there's a missing girl. He's caught up in this because of a number of different circumstances that pull him at the center of this, and he's sort of accused of being involved. But he does have this moment of realization of just how almost, like ether, a life could disappear, especially if that person is someone who maybe looks like him. And so that of course made me think of this summer and all of these the news headlines, and the realization of all of these now nearly maybe 1,300 potential graves that have been discovered in British Columbia and elsewhere in Canada on these residential schools of Indigenous people. I guess I just would love to hear you talk a little bit about erasure, and talk a little bit about how storytelling is so critical to sort of preserve.
Yeah, thank you for that. I was very much aware of these kind of questions around erasure, and even more specifically, when I started working with my editor, we had a lot of discussions about this. For example, Asheville is Cherokee land. There is a canoe race in the novel. Well, the reason why there's a canoe race in the novel is because there's historical record of Cherokees racing canoes in Asheville on the river. So I wanted, I wanted to bring in those parallels as much as possible to almost like reclaiming Cherokee existence in Asheville, for example. And then, and we may talk about this later, but that's why room 447 is really important, that Cowney and Essie spend time in. But also specifically about the missing girl, that, I was writing prior to the news about the graves kind of being discovered in Canada, but also the United States. But that wasn't news to Native communities. Like I always knew that, we always knew that these children were missing. And so what was more shocking was that the news coverage of it seemed surprising to people. That we knew these graves were there. We knew children never came home. And I think, as more is looked into in the United States, unfortunately, we're going to see that in the United States more and more. But I will say that wasn't in the media when I was writing or editing, but what was the growing awareness of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so my editor and I talked a lot about that in relationship to, even though the girl that goes missing is one of the prisoners, a daughter of one of the diplomats. I thought about her in context of missing and murdered Indigenous women not being erased, essentially, and then how easy that would be for a prisoner of war as well, in the time of war, to potentially be erased if it meant, avoiding international incidents, for example. So, I think all of these things are connected, and then that, to me, is important to connect us as human beings, right? That it doesn't matter what someone's background is. The threat of erasure is something that we should push back against always. And so whether it be history on land or just existence in general, I try to do that as much as possible because Native American people, especially away from Native communities, are often talked about in past tense. There are plenty of places, where plenty of people don't believe we still exist, and these are intelligent people. They just don't have the experience of being around Native people.
Wow. And thank you for also bringing up or bringing to light in this conversation the missing and murdered Indigenous women, because that was something that I thought about as well. And so I appreciate your saying that. As I think about this idea of pushing back against erasure, as you say in the prologue, or as you read from the prologue, this is Cowney retelling a story many, many years later. And there's a you referenced in the prologue. He's directly addressing someone, and without any spoilers or giving it away, we sort of learn more about who his intended audience is toward the end of the book. I'm curious as to whether or not you were writing from that to that particular audience as you were writing, or if that was something that came later in the process.
Yes and no. So that's I've never actually been asked this question in this nuanced way. So thank you for a new question. The yes part is that I did want, even, early on, Cowney to have a very clear voice. And I think when a narrator is speaking to an audience, there's a clearer voice, right? It's a more comfortable, casual voice, just like a conversation. And really, that I will always say is inspired by Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. I teach that book in my class, and that boy, it is a memoir, so it's different. He's writing to his son, but that distinct voice really just grabbed me. The moment I read that book the first time, and so I thought about how do you do that in fiction? How do you have such a strong narrator in fiction? And so I knew that I wanted it to be first person for that reason. And it was really just as I was working on the voice that it made sense that he would be talking to somebody And in a way, he's talking to us as the reader, right? When he says you, and we don't know who he's talking to. And I think that connects the narrator with the reader in that way. But your the second part of your question is, was I always thinking about a specific audience that he would be speaking to? And I didn't quite know who that was really until later in the book, when some of his relationships start kind of he starts working through his relationships, and we start learning what the long-term result of his relationships are, that made more sense later. And then kind of the final reveal of who he's talking to, really came much later when I was writing. And from the beginning, I didn't know that's exactly who he was talking to. I kind of knew an age of a person, but it changed over time.
That's fascinating. One of the blurbs on the back, it's the final blurb, and it says, thrilling, mysterious, and finally a revelation. And it is, I think there's a lot of really hard stuff in this story, and Cowney has dealt with some really difficult circumstances, and his life is hard in a lot of ways. And he experiences tragedy upon scary moment within the scope of the novel. And yet it still, to me, feels hopeful and revelatory and pure and beautiful at the end, when he's reflecting on this and sort of reflecting on his home place itself. Did you always see it going in that direction toward the end? Was it always going to have sort of a peaceful, for lack of a better word, way of ending?
I guess so. Of course, like everything, the ending does change. The characters make it change. I knew I didn't want to wrap it up with a bow. I didn't want it to be perfect at the end. I wanted the reader to feel like they had earned a little bit of a surprise or two at the end. But I guess I'm an optimistic person in general, because I didn't want to destroy everybody's hopes and dreams in the last chapter and say it's never getting better and we're all doomed. It's a hard balance, because I don't want to be cheesy, and I don't want to be unrealistic either. I certainly don't want to convey that life is perfect, but I do think it's important to be hopeful. I think that's the only way forward with progress in general. So I guess I always kind of knew it would be hopeful in some way.
Well, I think as you're saying this, it's making me remember something that you said earlier this evening, which is just that you were sort of raised on stories of resilience. And so I think that seems a fitting word sort of for the end of the story as well, that the story itself, and that Cowney especially, that there's a resilience to his story. And it is hard to offer a surprise to readers, and there were several in this novel, I have to say. Well done. And yes, it is not tied up in a neat bow or a perfect ending, but it is a satisfying one. So thank you for that. I would love to invite questions from our audience. You feel free to type them in the chat, and I will ask them to Annette. And I've got one already here, which is, this is a great question, because it speaks to the push and pull that Cowney is feeling. So what factors were pushing him away from his homeland, and what factors were holding him to it?
Sure. One of the factors that was pushing him away was his family situation. Cowney's father died. It technically is post World War I, but he's still in Europe there were troops still in Europe. And so Cowney's father had died when Cowney had never actually even met him. And Cowney's mother died in childbirth. So Cowney was raised by his grandmother, Leeshy, and his uncle, Bud. And Bud is not, what's the word? Empathetic, or, he's a little hard on Cowney. And so Cowney is really kind of tired of, being under his thumb at all. And, he went away to junior college for a little bit, didn't go so well, but he just feels like he might suffocate if he stays. And so he wants to see what might be available to him. And he's not really sure that he's going to college. He's not really sure what the Grove Park will lead to, but he's just curious enough to give it a try. So there's, this is a time period where there aren't job opportunities in Cherokee. Things like logging were kind of coming to an end, or the national park coming in. Tourism was taking root, but for a young man, there just aren't a lot of opportunities. So he's open to explore just down the road a little bit.
I'll just say again, if any of you have any questions, feel free to type them in and I'll be happy to ask them. While I wait for a few more to come through, I can ask another, which is, there's a wonderful sort of side character named Saucy. Am I saying that correctly?
Dodzy, but yeah.
Dodzy, okay. And Dodzy is, the whole community just sees him as this sort of old man. He's been there forever, might have actually been there forever. And he has sort of stolen a monkey from a traveling carnival, and it is now his pet, and it just sort of roams through the forests. Is this rooted in a real story, or is this purely a product of your wild imagination?
Well, I mean, if there is a monkey roaming wild in the Smoky Mountains, then obviously it's true. Like, it's obviously rooted in some fact. There's a story that Gary Carden, who is a folklorist, but a storyteller from Jackson County, North Carolina, tells about this monkey. His name was not Edgar. This is not the backstory I gave. Edgar the monkey is not part of Gary's story, but Gary does talk about a monkey that used to roam around and scare the living daylights out of hunters in the woods. And it's just, kind of a bizarre thing. And so I'd heard that story a while back, and it just, Edgar actually has a huge role in the novel. So I'll just kind of talk about all the roles that Edgar plays. One purpose for having Edgar in the novel, as you mentioned, Dodzy kind of springs him from this carnival, and that affords the opportunity to talk about captivity and Cherokee's history with captivity. Specifically, Dodzy talks about his family being imprisoned in stockades prior to the removal. That was what would happen. Communities would be rounded up, different sites, and put into stockades as a holding place before the remove would take place. And so that gives me the opportunity to talk to folks about that. And then also, I always like to push back against stereotypes in Native literature when I have the opportunity, but to do it in as subtle way as I can that is still hopefully impactful. So one of the stereotypes about Native peoples is that we are spiritual in the sense we can talk to animals and things like that, right? Think Disney Pocahontas. And I wish I could. Like, I talk to my dog all the time, and her name is Waffles, and she doesn't talk back. I'm still working on it, anyway, so I'd like to push back against those stereotypes. And so in the book, you'll notice there are there's references to two different bears, who in those scenes are really on the border of this kind of spiritual encounter with them. And bears in Cherokee culture are the most closely related animals to human beings. There was once a clan that was named for bears, because and you think about bears standing on their two legs. They're very human-like in a lot of their actions. And so people will hear that and think we have some weird animal spiritual connection, that is just so native of us. But I wanted to parallel that with Edgar the monkey as a commentary that, if we believe in scientific evolution, then we have no problem noticing our closeness to primates, as humans, that we accept that we are genetically closely related to primates. That seems reasonable. That doesn't seem magical. That doesn't seem spiritual. So what's the difference? So I use Edgar in that way as well. And then Edgar's, just his freedom and his need for freedom, and he's a little bit of a trickster in that sense, right? We think we hear Edgar. Doddsy loses him pretty early on in the book. I just, he just played such a role that I didn't expect, because he kept becoming more and more relevant, which also leads me to a really interesting story. So I was doing one of these events, and it was a group mostly from Asheville. And later I got an email from a man who's a historian who was on the call. And he told me that during this time, I didn't know any of this, during this time, there was a shop owner in downtown Asheville that had a monkey in his store. And local kids would go down and see the monkey. But then this is terrible. Then they would go up to the Grove Park when the internees were out on the yard, and these kids would climb the fences and act like monkeys to mock the prisoners there. I mean, it was like horrific imagery, but so bizarre, the connection that I just not randomly, but I chose to put in a monkey without knowing any of that history. It's weird, some of the connections.
Oh, that is fascinating. Yes, he's just sort of looming, above throughout the novel, and so he also adds to kind of the tension and the, Cowney's feeling of he's just always a little on edge, and he always is thinking, oh, it's probably just Edgar, but you don't really know.
Right.
Okay, two things. First, we would love to hear you read another passage if you don't mind, and it could be a passage about Edgar or place. You mentioned room 447, which I do have questions about, but we might not get to that. Any passage you're choosing?
Okay. Well, I'll read from about 447. I'm hoping everyone has a good sense of humor, because this is one of my favorite little passages, and I think it's funny. But I wrote it, so of course I think it's funny. This is from chapter 14, and so room 447. 4 and 7 are important Cherokee numbers, in our spirituality. So that is why the room is that number. And I'll tell you a story, another real life story about that in a second. But Essie and Cowney have found this kind of abandoned room in the Grove Park that nobody checks on. They're not really aware it's there. And so Essie and Cowney just spend their extra time in there. That's where they just hang out really and get to know each other. So I'll read, and then I think your question will probably get to what I talk about anyway. So I won't read all of it, but just starting at the second, let's see. Yeah, the second paragraph of chapter 14. Instead of making the drive home after work on Friday and back to the inn on Sunday, I chose to remain at the inn 7 days a week. Essie and I spent hours in 447, playing dominoes, reading in silence, or daydreaming out loud together. Occasionally, we joined the others on day trips off property if the weather was nice, but nothing more than a half an hour drive away. We retreated to the room so often that the evening fused into one long moment. There are snapshots of that summer, literal and otherwise, that refuse to fade, but not because they are fantastic or even significant, but because they are elemental to what is now my existence, what was Essie's too. Essie was likely the most proper girl I had ever met, and most certainly the most sophisticated girl from Cherokee. She fit into 447 like one of the first edition novels we found there. And because she fit, I fit by association, adopted into some modern clan by the clan mother herself. Mind you, that is where the maternal instincts began and ended. Essie corrected no more than my grammar on occasion. Quite the opposite, really. She led me to dangle on the edge of complete and utter failure and spin wildly in the awkwardness of it, dancing in delight at my blush. Go ahead, cow pie, I'll spot you, she encouraged. And before I remembered who I was, I found myself upside down, attempting to walk across the length of the room on my hands. I crashed gleefully into the couch, unable to spare my breath from life's thievery. Essie, too, was unable to remain on her feet, overcome with amusement. She sank into the oversized leather chair and vibrated in a nearly silent, wheezing laughter until the clearest expression of the word squirrel eked from her. I sat straight up, imagining that a varmint had joined our evening reverie. She too sat erect, but she was blushing, eyes wide, hand over her mouth. Squirrel? I repeated. Where? Essie didn't answer. Her eyes fell. It was clear that I had not actually heard what I thought I had. Did you just... She didn't move. Essie Stamper. Did you just pass wind? Cowpie, shut your mouth. You did. Hush. You did. Cowney Sequoyah, one does not speak like that to a lady. Well, most ladies don't speak through the backsides. She fell into herself, hawing loudly. I know, right? I couldn't help it. You got me so tickled. It sounded just like you said squirrel, or more like you said squirrel. I couldn't finish. I convulsed in the joy of her humanity. Stop it, Cowpie. You keep this up and I'll call up a whole mess of squirrels, an out-and-out scurry. Scurry of squirrels. Essie was always teaching me new words, most of which she likely found on the shelves of 447. My favorite word, though, of all the fancy, sophisticated, highfalutin words was cowpie. I know it sounds strange that I would want an attractive girl like Essie calling me a pile of cow manure, but even cow pies attract beautiful butterflies, delicate and indifferent to the stench of refuse.
Oh, what a perfect passage. The other one that made me snort in laughter was the cheerwine reference that comes later, which, it felt like such a good, North Carolina nod, and also was really funny because it did stain your teeth. It does stain your teeth.
Absolutely. And that squirrel reference, I cannot remember who said it, but I remember that came from real life, and I don't know who was involved in that, but I remember the squirrel reference in a situation like that.
The real life reference. Oh, good. And room 447 is this sanctuary for the two of them who are both from Cherokee, both sort of transported into this other world at the Grove Park Inn, just as a point of reference for everyone else. And they really spend, that's the part of the Grove Park Inn that we experience the most in the story.
Yeah.
Bill would like to know if any of the characters from the novel are still active in your writing. So are there any more stories involving any of these characters?
Not specifically. I'm working on a new novel that's contemporary, and I was kind of joking around with a colleague of mine about whether these people are related to the people and even as we breathe. And that's not the intention necessarily, but sometimes I think about it. Sometimes I think about, is this character, Essie's great-granddaughter, or some, I think about it in those terms, but not directly. I might start missing them more, when some of these events stop and I'm not, I feel like I'm talking to Essie and Cowney and Leashy every week. So maybe when that stops, I'll miss them and have to start including them.
What can you tell us about your upcoming project or your current project?
It seems like I can tell you less and less every day. It's contemporary. It's set in Cherokee with a female protagonist. But I'm doing two things. I'm trying to balance two things, which is looking at how we make specifically political decisions based on traditional Cherokee values or choose not to. So I've really dug back into some of our origin stories and mined out those value systems that are present, and kind of laying that over a contemporary political situation, and how we make those decisions, and then kind of balancing that with what happens when we're not actually telling our own stories, when other people are telling our stories, and what values that we adopt from that process. So I know it's really vague, but I won't get into plot details, but that gets just crazy at this point.
Well, we look forward to it. Any other audience questions? I'm watching the chat. Well, I will ask a question that I ask of everyone, which is, what are you reading? And and then also, or historically, what have you been your favorite books that you have read? You already referenced Between the World and Me.
Yeah, my favorite books are usually ones I teach. But let's see, what I'm reading now, this is atypical for me. I'm reading My Heart is a Chainsaw by another Native author who writes horror. And Stephen Graham Jones. Did I get that right? I think that's right. Somebody check me on that. I've got names confused a little bit. It is Stephen Graham Jones because I accidentally called him Stephen Graham Greene the other day. That's Graham Greene somebody else. But my favorite, I'll tell you what I'm teaching. Right now, I'm teaching God of Small Things by last name's Roy, Andrati Roy. And what else do I teach? Beloved, Toni Morrison, the all-time favorite. What else? And then Louise Erdrich is one of my favorite authors. Roundhouse is probably my favorite book of hers. Although The Night Watchman is, I guess, her latest that's out right now. So yeah, mostly I'm rereading stuff for class during the year, but I did pick up Stephen's book recently, and it's Halloween, so it's a good time to read it.
It is a fitting time. And as you said earlier, you are the first traditionally published or first published, as far as we know, author who is Eastern Band Cherokee Indian. But who are there other voices that we should have on our radars, maybe whose work hasn't even been published yet? Who should we be on the lookout for?
Oh, well, I will say published Cherokee Nation. The book is called Crooked Hallelujah, and Kelly Jo Ford is her name. She's Cherokee Nation, and her book came out about the same time mine did. And I think she's great, and she's really going to continue to write really important novels, especially for Cherokee Nation. I'd love to say that there are these budding novelists for the Eastern Band, but I'm really just trying to encourage people to get their work out there. You just can't find it. But people are telling stories, they're writing in their journals, they're sharing kind of what they're writing in their journals. So it's going to be a little while. But if you're on social media at all, any social media, and you start following one Native author, you're going to see a whole list of Native authors. If you start following one Appalachian author, you're going to see a whole list of Appalachian authors, because those networks of people are so supportive and encouraging, that I just think there's a lot of great voices coming out there. And I will plug my publisher, because I think University Press of Kentucky is doing a great job, and Fireside Industries continues to put out some really important voices in our region. And so I'm actually an editor for a series that University Press of Kentucky is doing that highlights diverse voices from the region. And and I think that we've got a lot of work in the pipeline that will be a great opportunity for new Appalachian voices. It's Appalachian Futures series is what it's called. So it's not looking to the past as much as it's looking to the future of our region.
I love that, and I look forward to. Do you have a sense of the timing of the release of that series, or the beginning of the release?
I know we've signed contracts, so what is this, 2021? I think 2022 will be, I think, the first release. Don't quote me. I won't.
I'll hold you to it. Well,
he's got it. Bill's got it pulled up on his phone. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Well, I just want to say we're bumping up to the end of our hour with you. I'm so grateful that you could be here. I know Charlotte Writers Club North has been so excited about this event for quite some time. So I'm glad that we could make it happen. Thank you for this book. Oh, hello.
He wanted to be on camera.
No.
Perfect.
Use the internet.
Oh, he wants to use the internet now. We've got to get off here. He wants to use the internet.
You know what? I've got a crowd probably lining at my doors who are about your size, who are also wondering when they're going to get to stream a movie or something, because I've been hogging the internet.
We're about done.
We are. First, I just have to say thank you for this beautiful book. It is complicated and nuanced and really well done. And so thank you for this story, and thank you in advance for the work to come.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate all of your support, and it's good to see some friendly faces, and just thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
We're so grateful. And you can find this at Main Street Books in store or online. I have to give a little plug. It's a beautiful book. Thanks so much, and have a good night, everyone.